I need to get something off my chest before this thing gets buried in a filing system somewhere and nobody ever reads it. I'm not a soldier. I want that on the record right now, first sentence, before anyone starts painting me as some kind of hero. I fix things for a living. Machines, mostly. Broken calibration units. Faulty atmospheric scrubbers. I once spent 11 hours reattaching a micro-weld bead to a ceremonial ion disperser because a delegate from the Hath Collective had sat on it by accident and didn't want to admit it. 11 hours. On a thing the size of my thumb. That's the kind of work I do. That's who I am. My name is Davin Moores. I'm 34 years old. I'm from a small city in the northern lowlands of Earth called Tarbeck. You've never heard of it, and that's fine because nobody has. I grew up fixing bikes. Then I fixed engines. Then I fixed things I didn't have a name for because the name only existed in some alien language I'd spent 3 years badly learning. And somehow, somewhere along the road between a garage in Tarbeck and the most prestigious orbital station in the known outer reach, I ended up standing in a room with a queen. Not just any queen. Her queen, the one the Vale species had followed for 11 of their centuries, which translated roughly to about 800 of our years, the one who had negotiated the Treaty of Pale Reaches. The one whose image hung in every diplomatic corridor on every station from Sector 2 to Sector 9. The one who was so far above my pay grade that the very concept of my pay grade would be offensive to acknowledge in her presence. She asked me to fix her crown, and she already knew what I was going to find. I didn't know that part yet. That part came later, and when it did, it changed everything I thought I understood about why I was standing in that room in the first place. But let me start from the beginning. Let me start the way I always start things, with the smell of machine oil and the sound of something that shouldn't be broken, being broken anyway. Chapter 1: The Call. The summons came on a Thursday. I know it was a Thursday because I had just started my 3rd cup of terrible coffee. The kind that tasted like it had been filtered through an old boot and left to cool for exactly too long, and I had specifically promised myself that Thursdays were going to be calm. No emergency repairs. No panic delegation aides hammering on my workshop door at 400 station time. No more sitting on cold metal floors in ventilation shafts, while some Hath engineer talked me through a schematic in a dialect I only half understood. Just coffee. Just quiet. Just me and the secondary calibration manifold on base 7 that I'd been meaning to service for 3 weeks. The comm buzzed. I looked at it, it buzzed again. I put down my coffee. This is how every disaster in my life has started, me. A cup of bad coffee and something buzzing. The ID on the screen wasn't a name. It was a clearance code. A long one, with the kind of prefix that meant it had come through more than one layer of encrypted relay before it reached my unit. In my 3 years on Aurelia Station, I had only seen that prefix twice. Once when the platform's main reactor had started cycling through a minor resonance fault, and once when a visiting dignitary's personal transport had developed a fuel compression issue mid-docking. Both times they'd needed a human. Not because we were the best. Anyone who's worked alongside Vale engineers or Hath technicians knows we're not the best, not by a long stretch. The Vale have been building technology for longer than my species had a written language. The Hath can process diagnostic data simultaneously across 14 cognitive streams, which means they can debug a system in the time it takes me to find my toolkit. But humans are trustworthy in a way the others aren't. Or maybe, and this is the thing I've only recently started to understand, we're unpredictable in a way the others aren't. And sometimes, that's what you need. I answered the call. The face on the screen wasn't a face I knew. It was a veiled, tall, silver-skinned in the way of her species, with the faint bioluminescent tracery at her temples that indicated high station. Not a servant, not an aide, a direct representative of the Queen's own household. "Technician Davin Moores," she said. Her basic was perfect, which meant she'd been practicing, which meant this conversation had been planned. "That's me," I said. "Her Radiance Queen Saravith requests your attendance. Crown repair. Immediate priority." I waited for more. There was no more. "When you say immediate." "The transport is waiting," she said. "Bay 12. She cut the connection. I looked at my coffee. I looked at the secondary calibration manifold. I picked up my toolkit. Chapter 2: The Station. Aurelius is not what most people picture when they imagine an orbital platform. Back on Earth when I was a kid, the space stations in films were all the same: white corridors, soft lighting, that gentle antiseptic smell that said clean future. Everything modular. Everything simple, clean lines and clean answers. Aurelius was none of those things. It had been built in stages over about 200 years, first by the Veil, then expanded by the Hath Collective, then modified again when the humans joined the Galactic Accord and needed their own habitation rings. The result was a structure that made absolutely no architectural sense and worked completely anyway, the way most things that have evolved rather than been designed tend to work. The inner rings were Veil, high ceilings, curved walls that seemed to breathe, soft resonance lighting that pulsed at frequencies calibrated to Veil biology. Walking through them as a human was a little like walking through the world's most beautiful headache. Beautiful to look at, but after about 20 minutes your brain started trying to sync its own rhythms to the light, and you'd come out the other side either deeply relaxed or mildly confused, depending on the day. The Hath rings were the opposite: low, dense, filled with the constant low-grade hum of their processing arrays and the faint ozone smell of active computational clusters. Hath architecture prioritized information flow over aesthetics. Their corridors were mapped according to data efficiency, not human comfort, which meant that to a human walking them, they seemed deliberately designed to feel slightly wrong. Turns in the wrong places. Doors at angles that made you duck when you didn't need to. Lighting that illuminated floors more than walls, because Hath orientation was primarily downward. The human ring was exactly what you'd expect: a little ugly, a little functional, a little too warm, and full of the kind of personal decoration that our species apparently can't resist no matter where we are. Someone had put plants in the corridor outside the main mess hall. Someone else had taped a hand-drawn picture to the door of Workshop 3. It said we fix things in blocky letters, with a cartoon wrench below it. I had drawn that. I'm not much of an artist. The transport that took me from the human ring to the inner Veil quarter was a small sealed shuttle, the kind used for inter-ring transfers when someone needed to cross atmospheric gradients without walking. The Veil ring was maintained at a slightly different pressure and temperature than the human ring, calibrated to what Veil biology preferred. Not unsafe for humans, just a little thin, a little cool, like stepping outside on a clear autumn morning, except that outside was a pressurized corridor 60,000 kilometers above the nearest planet. I'd made this trip before, not to the Queen's residence quarter obviously, but to the service levels beneath it a few times for general maintenance. I knew the corridors, I knew the checkpoints. There were more checkpoints than usual. The first one was standard: 2 Veil guards, tall, impassive in the silver and dark formal armor of the royal household detail. They scanned my credentials. They scanned my toolkit. They looked at me the way that Veil guards always looked at humans. Not with hostility, exactly, but with the careful assessment of beings who had seen our species arrive at the interstellar table and were still making up their minds about us. Humans had only been in the Accord for 40 years. In Veil terms, that was approximately last week. "Through," said the taller of the 2 guards. In basic that was correct but clipped. The second checkpoint was less standard. It was staffed by a species I didn't immediately recognize: humanoid but heavier built, with dark plates of chitin across their shoulders and upper arms. Not Hath, Not any of the standard Accord species. They wore a different uniform, darker, with a crest on the chest that I didn't know. They looked at my credentials for a longer time. They looked at my toolkit for a longer time. They looked at me for the longest time. The one in the center, broader than the others, with a deliberate stillness that read in any species as practiced authority, spoke to his colleague in a language I didn't have. The colleague replied in the same language. The leader looked back at me. "Your function," he said, in basic but heavily accented, the kind of accent that came from a language built on sounds humans didn't naturally make. "Technician," I said, "I repair things." "You repair the crown." "I've been asked to examine it, yes." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not readable to me, too alien, but something shifted. He stepped aside. The third checkpoint didn't stop me at all. The veil attendant there simply opened the door and gestured through, and I stepped into a corridor unlike anything I'd seen in my 3 years on Aurelius. The Queen's residence quarter was, and I'm going to sound like an idiot saying this, alive. Not literally. Calm down. But the walls had a quality to them that I didn't have the language for. They were dark, deep blue, with that bioluminescent veil tracery running through them in patterns I only later learned were actually language, ancient script, embedded in the structure itself, a record of every queen who had occupied these chambers going back to the founding of the Accord. The light moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, just moved, like something breathing slowly in its sleep. The ceiling was high enough that I couldn't see it clearly. The floor was warm. And standing in the center of the corridor, waiting for me with the particular stillness of someone who has never had to hurry in their life, was Queen Saravith of the Veil. Chapter 3: The Queen. I had seen pictures. Pictures are liars. In the images that circulated through the station's public archives, Queen Saravith appeared tall and silver-skinned and regal, with the luminescent patterns at her temples, and a bearing that communicated authority through every line of her body. She looked ancient and composed and thoroughly intimidating. In person, she was all of that and something else. Something I hadn't expected. She was tired. Not visibly, not in the way humans get tired, slumping and hollow-eyed and desperate for a flat surface. Her bearing was still perfect. Her posture was still the kind that made my own spine reflexively straighten. But there was something in the set of her eyes, deep violet, with that particular veil depth that always made me feel like I was looking into something very far away, that said this has gone on too long. She was holding the crown. I use that word, crown, because it's the closest human word, but it wasn't a crown in the way we'd think of it. It wasn't a ring of metal sitting on the head. It was a construction of resonance filaments and crystalline nodes, designed to rest across the upper portion of the veil's skull in a way that interacted with their bioluminescent biology. The Queen's mark, the symbol of continuity that the veil used to signal the living presence of sovereignty. The filaments were currently dark. She was holding it, not wearing it, and in the flat light of the corridor it looked like a broken halo. "Technician Moores," she said. Her basic was not just correct, it was beautiful. The kind of fluency that only comes from genuine sustained engagement with a language, not just instruction. She'd spoken with humans enough that it had worked its way into her. "Your Radiance," I said, and tried to remember what I'd been told about veil formal address. Don't bow, the veil don't bow. Don't extend your hand, the veil greeting protocol for a first meeting with royalty was eyes forward and voice steady. Don't look overwhelmed. I was overwhelmed. I tried not to show it. She studied me for a moment. "You know what the crown does," she said. It wasn't a question. "In general terms," I said. "Resonance filaments, bioelectric interface, ceremonial functions. I've read the public maintenance specifications." "Yes." She looked down at the object in her hands. "The crown has a primary ceremonial function and a secondary one. The secondary function is not in the public specifications." I waited. She held it out to me. I took it very carefully with both hands. It was lighter than I expected. The resonance filaments weighed almost nothing independently, and the crystalline nodes, which looked dense, were primarily internal lattice structure and held very little mass. But there was something about it. A faint vibration in the material, almost below the threshold of feeling. The kind of thing you notice because you stop noticing it when it stops. The secondary system has failed, she said. I need to know why. What does the secondary system do? She was quiet for a moment, not the hesitation of someone deciding whether to say something, more like someone who has already decided and is simply choosing the best place to begin. It listens, she said. I looked up from the crown. It listens, she repeated. The resonance filaments are calibrated to detect patterns in the ambient bioelectric field, specifically the collective emotional state of those present in a given space, a very old function. One that has existed in the crown since before the accord, since before the human species had invented the wheel. It is how the queen reads the room. I understood then why this wasn't in the public specifications. And it stopped working. It stopped working, she said carefully, exactly 9 days ago. Something in the way she said exactly made me pay close attention. 9 days ago, I repeated, when the Galactic Accord security delegation arrived at this station. There it was. I looked at the crown in my hands. I looked at the queen. You think someone interfered with it? She didn't answer immediately. She turned slightly, looking at the wall where that ancient script moved and breathed in its bioluminescent language. Then she turned back. I know someone interfered with it, she said. What I need you to find is how. And I need a human to find it because a human technician working alone will draw less notice than any veiled diagnostic team. And because, she paused, humans notice things differently. Differently than veil. Differently than everyone. I thought about that. Your radiance, I said. If this is an interference investigation, if someone tampered with this, shouldn't I be bringing this to security? You will, she said, when you have found the answer, not before, because the answer will tell us something that the question cannot. The how will tell us the who, and the who will tell us something about this delegation that I suspect I already know. I want the evidence first. Then security. She held my gaze. Can you find it? I looked at the crown. I looked at the vibrating filaments, dark now, quiet, waiting for something. I can try, I said. Good, said Queen Sarevith, and something crossed her face, not quite a smile, not quite, more like relief that hadn't let itself fully arrive yet. I have been watching you for some time, Technician Moores. You fixed the atmospheric calibration unit in the Hath diplomatic wing 4 months ago. The Hath delegation told me it was a fault in the primary coupling. You found the fault was in the secondary coupling, where someone had adjusted it slightly, just slightly, so that the primary would fail in a predictable way 3 weeks later. I remembered that. I remembered thinking I was probably overthinking it. That was subtle sabotage, I said slowly. Yes, said the Queen. The delegation was the Gavosi Trade Group. They were negotiating. Atmospheric processing contract rights, she said. Yes. And the calibration fault, had it fully manifested during the formal negotiation period, would have required a Hath engineering team to be reassigned to emergency repair rather than attending the negotiating sessions, giving the Gavosi representatives a smaller opposition at the table. I stared at her. You knew about that then? I suspected, she said. I know now because I have been watching what happens on this station. I watch through many eyes, but I need proof, and I need it found by hands that no one is watching. She glanced at my toolkit. No one watches the human repairman, she said. That is, I think, about to stop being true, but we still have a window. Chapter 4, The Workbench. There is something deeply calming about taking a broken thing apart. I know that sounds strange, but there's a moment right at the beginning when you open up a machine and look at its insides, where the chaos of what's wrong shifts into the clarity of here are the parts. Here is the thing as it actually is, rather than as it should be. And from actually looking, you start to understand. They gave me a small antechamber off the main corridor of the Queen's Quarter, a table. Good lighting. I had to ask for different lighting because the Vale ambient spectrum made my depth perception slightly unreliable, and the attendant who brought me the new light source looked mildly baffled but didn't argue. My toolkit. A diagnostic interface that I had to spend 20 minutes figuring out because it was Vale manufactured and calibrated for six-fingered hands, but I managed. And the crown. I set it on the table and looked at it. The resonance filaments were arranged in a specific geometry, 12 primary strands, each terminating in a crystalline node, branching from a central ring of denser material that was the interface core. The geometry wasn't arbitrary. I'd pulled the public specifications on my way over in the transport, reading while the shuttle hummed around me, and I could see the logic of it. 12 filaments meant 12 separate detection points distributed around the wearer's head. The nodes amplified the signal at each point. The central ring integrated the signals into a unified readout that fed back through the bioelectric interface into the wearer's own nervous system. In simple terms, the crown's listening function worked by essentially giving the Queen an extra sense, a distributed antenna for emotional current. The kind of thing that, if you were trying to manipulate a queen into not perceiving what was happening in the room around her, you would very much want to disable. I started at the central ring. It looked fine. I ran a diagnostic sweep through the interface protocol, slowly, because the Vale diagnostic system had menus that opened in counterintuitive orders, and I'd already accidentally triggered a calibration reset once and spent 15 minutes getting the thing back to neutral. The central ring showed full integrity. No fractures, no corrosion, no physical damage. Its power cycling was clean, its resonance frequency stable. I moved to the filaments. One by one, methodically, the way you do it when you don't know where the problem is and you can't afford to skip anything. I had done this with everything from engine control units to atmospheric processors to the tiny, maddening components of ceremonial technology from 6 different species, and the approach was always the same. Start at the thing that's obvious. When the obvious thing looks fine, start at the next obvious thing. Keep going until you find the part that doesn't match the pattern. Filaments 1 through 9, clean. Filament 10, clean. Filament 11, clean. Filament 12. I stopped. The filament itself was clean. No damage, no interference. But the node at the end of it, the crystalline amplifier, had a reading that didn't match the others. Not a break, not a fracture. A calibration offset. Tiny, genuinely, impressively tiny. If I hadn't been specifically checking calibration values rather than structural integrity, I would have missed it entirely. The node was tuned to a frequency that was 0.003% off from its design specification. A deviation so small that every automatic diagnostic sweep would round it to 0 and flag the component as functional. But it wasn't functional. At 0.003% offset, the node would still transmit. It would just transmit at a frequency that the central ring was calibrated to reject as noise. Elegant. And it wasn't natural drift. Natural drift in crystalline components happened across all nodes simultaneously, driven by thermal cycling and usage. If this was natural drift, all 12 nodes would show similar deviations. 11 of them were clean. One node, one specific node, precisely adjusted to fall just inside the noise threshold. Someone had been inside this crown. I sat back for a moment and let myself feel the weight of that. Someone had gotten close enough to the Queen of the Vale to her most personal ceremonial object, her literal interface with the people around her, and had made a change so subtle it was designed to be undetectable. And they'd done it 9 days ago, when the security delegation arrived. I picked up the crown again and looked at Node 12 under magnification. There, and I almost missed it even then, was a mark. Not quite a scratch, more like the ghost of tool contact, the kind that a laser-fine instrument leaves when it makes an adjustment to a crystalline surface. The mark was consistent with a precision resonance tuner, the specific type used by, and I had to check this against my database, pulling up the tool specifications while I held the magnifier steady. The specific type issued standard to members of the Kesari Technical Corps. The Kesari. I sat very still. The security delegation was led by Admiral Carvin of the Kesari hierarchy. Chapter 5, The Corridor. I needed to get back to the Queen. I needed to get back to the Queen without walking past the second checkpoint, the one staffed by the beings I hadn't recognized, the dark-armored ones with the chitin plates and the crest I didn't know. The crest I didn't know. I pulled up the station's diplomatic registry on my datapad and searched it while I was still in the antechamber, cross-referencing the description against the visual database. It took me 3 tries because I was describing it from memory, and my visual memory for alien species insignia is not great, but I eventually got there. The crest was Kesari Security Command. The beings at the second checkpoint weren't station staff. They were part of the delegation. And they were positioned between the Queen's quarter and the rest of the station. I put my datapad away. I put the crown very carefully into the protective carry case that the Queen's attendant had provided. I picked up my toolkit. I thought about the route. There are things about being a maintenance technician on a multi-species orbital station that aren't obvious from the outside. One of them is that you learn the station differently from everyone else. You learn the corridors that aren't on the public maps, the service access routes, the ventilation interchange passages, the old structural inspection shafts that predate the last expansion and haven't been formally decommissioned, but also haven't been formally maintained in a long time. You learn them because your job takes you there. I knew a route from the Queen's Quarter to the central hub that bypassed the second checkpoint entirely. It went through a service corridor that ran behind the Vale Ring's residential section, accessible through a utility panel I'd worked behind twice before. The panel would be unlocked. It was always unlocked, on the grounds that maintenance workers needed access, and the Vale Interior Security Team had never specifically designated it as a checkpoint because it wasn't on the primary circulation maps. I was most of the way there when they found me. There were 3 of them, Kesari security in the dark armor blocking the service corridor from the other direction. The one in front was larger than the ones at the checkpoint, a different designation I realized. These weren't guards, these were operatives. They hadn't been following me. They'd been waiting. Which meant they'd known I would take this route. Which meant they'd been watching me before I even started taking it. Which meant this had been anticipated. My examination of the crown, my discovery, my attempt to get back to the Queen, all of it anticipated and planned around. The one in the front spoke in basic. Technician, he said, the crown. Not a request. I looked at them. I want to be honest here, because I said at the beginning that I'm not a soldier, and I mean it. Standing in a narrow service corridor with 3 Kesari operatives in front of me and no clear exit behind me, what I felt was not the calm courage you read about in stories. It was fear. Clear, present, physical fear. The kind that lives in your chest and makes your hands want to drop what they're holding and your legs want to make decisions your brain hasn't approved. But here's the thing about fear, it's information. And I'm good at processing information. I thought about what I knew. I knew they were Kesari security operatives, not station guards, which meant they had no legal authority over me on Aurelius, which was Accord-neutral ground, which meant anything they did here was a galactic Accord incident, not a routine security action, which meant that whatever they were planning, they needed it to look controllable. They could not simply take the crown from me by force in an Accord-maintained corridor without creating exactly the kind of diplomatic incident their operation was designed to avoid. They wanted me to hand it over, and they needed me to do it quietly, which meant I had something they didn't want me to have, and the most dangerous thing I could do right now was be quiet about it. I did something that, looking back, I cannot fully explain as a rational decision because it wasn't entirely one. I opened my mouth and I spoke, loudly, in standard, which carried through corridors better than basic. Station security, I said. I am DAVANMOORS, Technician 3rd Class, Human Quarter, Badge number 477 Alpha. I am in the VAEL Residential Tier Service Corridor, Section J9. I have unauthorized personnel blocking MY route. I am carrying an item from the Queen's residence, and I am requesting immediate station security response. Station comms are always open in service corridors. It's a safety standard. Maintenance workers can call for help at any time, from anywhere in the maintenance network, and the call goes directly to the station's emergency response system. I had about 30 seconds before the Kesari operatives decided that the calculus had changed and that getting the crown was worth the incident. They stared at me. The leader said something to the others in Kesari, rapid, clipped, clearly an adjustment to a plan that had just gone sideways. And then from behind them, from the direction they'd come from, there was a sound. A door opening. And then another sound. A sound I'd never heard in person, only in historical records, only in the old footage from the early Accord ratification ceremonies. The resonance hum of active Veil sovereign technology, the specific frequency that the Veil had coded into their most significant artifacts as a signal, an alert, an announcement. The crown in the case in my hands had come back online. Chapter 6, The Queen's Move. She had been there the entire time. Not in the corridor, but near it. Near enough that the crown, once I had inadvertently reactivated its primary function by jostling the carry case during the confrontation, could complete the bioelectric handshake that it maintained with its sovereign. Queen Sarevith did not rush. She did not raise her voice. She walked into the service corridor as though it were her throne room, which, on this station, on any station in the outer reach at any gathering of the Accord it effectively was. She was wearing the formal crown. No, I realized. She was wearing a formal crown, a different one, ceremonial, that she'd had on while I was in the antechamber, and in her hand she held a communicator. She had already been in contact with Accord Station Authority. She had already filed the incident report. The 3 Kesari operatives in the corridor knew it. You could see it in the way their posture changed. Not defeated. They weren't the kind of beings who looked defeated easily, but recalculated. The way a piece on a board looks when the player holding it has just understood that the position has changed. The Queen looked at them, then she looked at me. Then she looked at the carry case in my hands, and something in her face, very briefly, was not regal at all. It was something far more human. Relief and fear and anger all at once, the way any living creature looks when something they've been dreading is finally here and they can finally deal with it. Technician Moores, she said, her voice was calm, please stand to my left. I walked to her left. The Kesari leader looked at the Queen. He said something in his own language. She replied in his language, fluent, unhesitating, with the kind of precision that meant she had been ready for this conversation. Whatever she said, it worked. The 3 operatives stepped back. They didn't leave, but they stepped back, and the leader's hand moved away from whatever implement had been at his side. Accord Station Authority arrived 90 seconds later. 5 humans, 2 Veil, 1 Hath. The humans were security. The Veil were diplomatic liaisons. The Hath, I recognized him. It was Senior Analyst Krethva, who I had once helped debug a faulty climate controller in his office, and who had given me a surprisingly good bottle of Hath-fermented grain spirit in gratitude. He looked at the Kesari operatives, he looked at me, he looked at the crown case. Then he looked at the Queen. Whatever passed between them, in that look, happened faster than I could follow. "Detain," said the Queen softly. All 3. They were detained. Chapter 7, The Explanation. It took most of the rest of that day for everything to come out. I spent a significant portion of it in a debriefing room with 2 station authority investigators and a Veil diplomatic official who I later learned was the Queen's own legal counsel, a being whose title translated, roughly, as voice of continuity, and who had apparently been part of the Queen's household for over a century. She was old, even by Veil standards. She had the kind of stillness in her that only comes from having been present for a very long time. She didn't question me. She listened while the investigators questioned me, and she occasionally made small notes, and at one point she put her hand on the table between us in a gesture I was later told was a Veil expression of professional acknowledgement, like a nod, but older. I told them everything, every step, the calibration offset on node 12, the tool mark consistent with a Kesari precision resonance tuner, the timing exactly 9 days, exactly coinciding with the delegation's arrival, the service corridor, the operatives. The investigators recorded it all. When they were done, the older Veil official, the voice of continuity, said, in perfect and ancient-sounding basic, "You were not afraid of them." I thought about this. "I was very afraid of them," I said. She looked at me. "But you shouted." "Yes." "Why?" I thought about it for a moment. Because being afraid and doing nothing are 2 different choices. I was afraid, and doing nothing was going to have a worse outcome than doing something. She was quiet for a moment. "This is the thing about humans," she said. "The other species know this, but they don't feel it the same way. They calculate it, you do it." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. "The Crown's listening function," she continued, "has existed since before the Accord, long before. In the old world, before first contact, before the Veil reached space, it was the thing that kept queens from being manipulated by courts. It let them know what the room was actually feeling versus what the room was performing. It has saved this species from bad decisions more times than I can number." She looked at the table. 9 days ago, Admiral Carvin of the Kesari hierarchy arrived with his delegation with the intention of negotiating a new defense treaty. The terms he is proposing would give the Kesari hierarchy significant influence over Accord patrol routes in sectors 6 through 9. The Queen's advisors have been reviewing the proposal for 3 weeks. The Queen had questions. She paused. When the Crown's listening function is active, the Queen can feel whether the people across from her are afraid or confident or hiding something or telling the truth as they understand it. She cannot read minds, but she can feel what the room is actually made of under the performance. And with it disabled, I said slowly, she'd be negotiating blind. Blind to the emotional subtext, yes, which, for a species that has evolved to read that subtext with enormous precision, is not merely an inconvenience. It is a significant disadvantage at a negotiating table. I thought about Admiral Carvin. I thought about the proposed treaty. I thought about patrol routes in sectors 6 through 9, which I didn't know enough about to judge strategically, but which sounded like the kind of thing that mattered very much to whoever controlled them. He wanted to negotiate while she couldn't read the room, I said. He wanted to negotiate while she thought she could read the room, the voice corrected. Which is different. The Crown still functioned for primary ceremonial purposes. It still displayed, to all observers, as fully operational. If the Queen had not noticed the subtlety, if she had not suspected and sought an examination, she might have gone into those negotiations believing her instincts were working, not knowing they were not. That's when I stopped. Yes, she said, it is. Does Admiral Carvin know she figured it out? He will, shortly. The 3 operatives he sent to intercept you will have been instructed to inform him if the retrieval failed. She made a very small gesture with one hand. This is why the timing mattered. He needed the crown before we could document the interference. I thought about the service corridor, the 3 operatives waiting there. The fact that they'd known which route I'd take, which meant they'd had someone watching the Queen's quarter, watching me, from the moment I arrived. I walked right into it, I said. You walked right through it, she said. There is a difference. Chapter 8, The Thing About Humans. I saw the Queen one more time before the diplomatic fallout started consuming everyone's attention. She came to my workshop. Not the other way around, she came to me. Walked through the human ring with 2 attendants and the kind of absolute composure that, in the human quarter, drew a crowd of gawking station workers in about 30 seconds. I heard the commotion before I saw her. Looked up from the secondary calibration manifold which I had, finally, gotten to, and there she was in the doorway of Workshop 3, next to the "We Fix Things" sign with the cartoon wrench. She looked at the sign for a moment. I stood up very quickly. Your Radiance, I didn't know you were. I should have sent word, she said. I did not because I wanted to see where you worked. She looked around the workshop. The cluttered benches, the components in various stages of repair, the tools hanging from their racks in the order I'd developed over 3 years, which made sense to me and to nobody else. The terrible coffee maker in the corner that I had repaired with a piece of wire and stubbornness when it broke 18 months ago. This is where you think, she said. It's where I fix things. Yes, she looked back at me. The tiredness I had seen in her face that morning was still there, but it sat differently now. Not the tiredness of someone under pressure. The tiredness of someone who has been holding a weight for a long time and has just slightly adjusted their grip. I owe you a direct explanation, Technician Moores. I said this morning that I had been watching you. I want to be clear about what I meant. She sat down, with the natural ease of someone who has never had to think about whether a seat was prepared for them, on the workshop stool by the bench. Her attendant stayed near the door. When the Kesari delegation arrived 9 days ago, I already had suspicions about Admiral Carvin's intent, specific ones. His proposed treaty benefits the Kesari in ways he has presented as mutual, but which my advisors and I have been analyzing. There are irregularities, points where what he says and what the text of the proposal says are subtly misaligned. She paused. When the crown failed, I understood what it meant, but I needed to understand how, and I needed that understanding documented before I could act. A veiled diagnostic team would have been immediately noticed. The delegation would have known the examination was happening and would have had time to respond, to reframe, to create alternative narratives. I needed someone who moved beneath notice. A human repairman. A human repairman who had, 4 months ago, found something in a broken atmospheric calibration unit that every automated diagnostic had missed. Something subtle and deliberate. She held my gaze. I watched that case very carefully. I watched you look at the evidence and come to the correct conclusion before anyone else was even framing the question. I felt strange, seen in a way I hadn't expected from this direction. I was just doing my job, I said. Yes, she said, that is exactly what I needed, someone doing their job. Not someone looking for conspiracy, not someone building a theory, someone simply looking at the thing as it was, and noticing when the thing did not match what the thing should be. She was quiet for a moment. There is something about your species that the others in the Accord have not yet fully understood, she said. You are very young by our scales. You have been among us for 40 years. Many of the older Accord species are still deciding what you are, whether you are a resource, or a nuisance, or something to be managed carefully until your brief lives complicate things too much. They see your youth and they mistake it for limitation. But you don't, I said. Your youth is a form of independence, she said. You have not been shaped by our political history the way the Vale have, or the Hath, or the Kesari. You carry no old allegiances, no ancient grudges that make you predictable. When you look at something, you are not seeing it through 300 years of accumulated expectation. You are simply looking. She looked at the workshop, the benches, the tools. And somehow, she said, that is the most dangerous thing in a room full of very ancient, very sophisticated beings who have learned to see only what they expect. I didn't know what to say. The Kesari operatives, she continued, were looking for someone who fit the profile of a threat. They were watching for diplomatic staff, for Vale household agents, for anyone connected to the Queen's intelligence network. They had a very clear picture of what danger looked like. She looked at me. They were not watching the human repairman. Until I started shouting, I said. Something very close to a smile crossed her face. Until you started shouting, she agreed. Chapter 9: The Fallout. The diplomatic fallout from the corridor incident, which is what it had started being called by the time the station authorities' formal report was filed, was significant. Significant enough that I caught pieces of it over the following weeks through the background noise of the station, the way you catch a storm through a window you're not looking directly at. Admiral Carvin did not deny the interference. That surprised me initially. But the voice of continuity explained it later, when we crossed paths in the station's main administrative corridor, and she paused to speak with me for a few minutes. He could not deny it, she said. Your documentation was precise. The tool mark, the calibration offset, the timing, all of it linked directly to Kesari security equipment. A denial would only have created a second incident on top of the first. So what did he do? He reframed, she said. He claimed the interference was an internal Kesari security action, a protection protocol, he called it. A precaution against Vale royal technology being used as an intelligence-gathering tool in a neutral diplomatic context. He suggested that the Crown's emotional sensing function represented an unfair advantage in negotiations. I thought about this. Is he wrong? She was quiet for a moment. He is not entirely wrong. The Crown does give the Queen an advantage. But he knew about the Crown before he came here. It is not a secret. Every major Accord species knows about the Crown's secondary function. It is part of the Vale diplomatic profile, documented going back centuries. If he found it objectionable, the appropriate response was to raise it before arriving, not to secretly disable it. He wanted the advantage, I said. He just wanted it on his side. Yes, she said simply. The treaty negotiations were suspended, not canceled, suspended. The Accord process moved slowly, deliberately, with the intention of being thorough rather than fast, and a suspended negotiation was not a failed one. It meant everything was paused while the interference incident was formally reviewed and the terms were re-examined. I heard, through the grapevine of station gossip that runs through the maintenance corps like a river, that the re-examination had found several other points in Admiral Carvin's proposed treaty that were not what they appeared. Places where the language created obligations that weren't obvious from a surface reading. Places where patrol route adjustments would have given the Kesari military a presence in sectors they had no current basis for patrolling. Not a defense treaty, a positioning operation. The Kesari weren't the only ones who wanted those sectors. But they were the only ones who had tried to get them through a negotiation engineered in their favor by first blinding the woman across the table from them. Admiral Carvin was recalled to the Kesari hierarchy within 3 weeks of the incident. A new delegation arrived, different faces, different lead negotiator, notably without the private security operatives. The negotiations, I was told, restarted from a genuinely different position. I didn't follow the details closely. That wasn't my world. My world was Workshop 3, and the secondary calibration manifold, and the terrible coffee. Chapter 10, The Node. I repaired the crown. She asked me to formally, through the household attendant. An official request, logged through the station's maintenance system as a scheduled item, item 7441 in the Aurelius maintenance log, filed under ceremonial technology, veil, repair of calibration offset, node 12. The most mundane-sounding entry in the history of galactic diplomacy. It took me 4 hours. The actual repair, recalibrating the node to its correct frequency, took about 20 minutes. The other 3 hours and 40 minutes were me triple-checking everything. Checking all 12 nodes individually, then together, then running a full system diagnostic through the interface protocol, then checking it again. Running a resonance pattern analysis to confirm the bioelectric handshake was operating at full fidelity. Making sure that what I was giving back was whole, actually whole, not just apparently whole. When it was done, I held the crown in my hands for a moment before putting it in the carry case. It was humming. The right hum this time, not the forced, partial hum of a compromised system, but the full resonance of something operating the way it was designed to. The vibration I'd noticed when the Queen first put it in my hands was back, but stronger, more even, like a voice finding its range after being forced to whisper. 12 nodes. All singing the same frequency.